A crowded city sidewalk. Dozens of people passing by, some stopping to record on their phones. A police officer in uniform, voice raised, pointing, stepping closer. And in front of him, an elderly black man standing still, calm, and silent. At first glance, it looked like a man refusing to obey an officer's command. But what unfolded in the next few minutes would silence a city, and leave behind a lesson that would ripple far beyond that street. Welcome to King of Tales. I'm Jordan, and today, you'll hear a story about how one quiet man reminded the world that strength isn't always loud, and that respect, once lost, can become the most powerful lesson of all. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the cameras. Before the shouting. Before the world started watching. His name was Thomas Grant. He was 72 years old, a man with a tired face and steady eyes. Every morning, he followed the same path, down a few blocks in the downtown district, passing cafes, shops, and sometimes protests or political rallies. He wasn't there to participate. Just to walk. It was part of his routine. And eventually, that walk would lead him to a community shelter where he volunteered 5 days a week. He served food. Talked to the lost. Gave comfort without judgment. Most people passed by him without noticing. A quiet old man, in the same jacket every day, with a calm presence and no need for attention. But Thomas had a story most people couldn't imagine. Years ago, he had served in the Navy. Not just as a soldier, but as a commanding officer. He had led rescue missions overseas, navigated impossible diplomatic tensions, and received medals that he never displayed. He kept his service private, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he believed that the loudest people were rarely the ones doing the real work. His strength wasn't in how he spoke, it was in how he lived. On a Friday morning, a protest was gathering in front of a government building downtown. The atmosphere was tense but peaceful. People carried signs, spoke through megaphones, and stood side by side to voice their frustrations. Thomas happened to be walking past. He stopped, leaned against a lamppost, and simply watched. Not as a participant. Not as a critic. Just as a man who had seen too much of the world to look away from people trying to change it. That's when Officer Daniels saw him. Young, white, sharp features, heavy presence. Known in the department for being firm with anyone he considered out of place. To him, Thomas standing there alone was suspicious. Why would an old man just be standing there? Why wasn't he moving along? In his mind, Thomas became a potential threat, not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like. Daniels approached with confidence, his voice cutting through the noise. "Move along, sir," he said, firm and loud. Thomas turned, nodded respectfully, and replied, "Just watching." Peacefully. But that wasn't enough. Daniels stepped closer. "I said move," he repeated, placing a hand on Thomas's chest and giving a slight shove. A few people nearby turned to look. One lifted a phone and started recording. Thomas looked him in the eyes. His expression didn't change. No fear. No defiance. Just stillness. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. Daniels took a step back, raised his voice, now aware that cameras were rolling. "Do not resist me," he barked. "I will arrest you right here." People began gathering. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything." Another added, "Why are you bothering him?" But Daniels wasn't listening. He saw an old man standing in a space he didn't think he belonged. He saw no military ribbons. No medals. No signs of importance. And so, in his mind, Thomas had no authority, no reason to be there, and no reason to speak. But Thomas had faced far greater threats than this. He had stood in war zones. Negotiated with armed groups. Risked his life to bring peace to others. And in all those moments, the only thing he had truly feared was what he saw now, prejudice in power. The tension thickened. Daniels placed his hand on his belt, ready to escalate. People screamed. Phones captured everything. And Thomas? He slowly reached into his coat. Daniels shouted, "Don't move." But Thomas continued, slow and deliberate, eyes never leaving the officer. From inside his coat, he pulled out a worn leather folder. He handed it over, without a word. Daniels snatched it and opened it, ready to find some excuse to detain the man. But instead, he found a military ID. A Navy service card. A photo of a young officer, calm, powerful, and focused. Below that, official documentation of commendations. Medals awarded for service and leadership. And tucked in the back, laminated and folded once down the middle, a newspaper clipping dated 1987, Commander leads International Rescue Mission. There was Thomas, uniform crisp, standing beside world leaders. Daniels froze. He looked up. Looked back at the photo. Looked again at the man standing in front of him, no longer just a silent stranger, but a leader who had once carried lives on his shoulders. The crowd was silent now. Whispers passed between those watching. One person muttered, "He's a war hero," another said, "What did that cop just do?" Daniels slowly handed back the folder, unsure what to say. Thomas took it, nodded once, and said quietly, "Next time, ask who someone is before deciding what they're not." He walked away without looking back. And that was the moment everything changed. Thomas walked away without looking back. He didn't need to. The silence behind him said everything. Officer Daniels stood frozen, the leather folder still burned into his memory, his own voice echoing back at him in shame. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, not with chaos, but with reverence. People who had arrived to protest injustice now carried a new kind of conviction, one born from witnessing the quiet dismantling of prejudice by presence alone. That video, captured by multiple phones, spread across the internet within hours. But unlike many confrontations between police and civilians, this one didn't trigger arguments. It triggered reflection. The title on one post read, "Officer Harasses elderly man, then realizes he just disrespected a war hero." Another called him, "the man who didn't raise his voice but changed the room." Veterans began commenting. Dozens shared their own stories of being dismissed or ignored after years of service. Some even recognized Thomas. "He was my commanding officer," one wrote. "Taught me everything I know about honor." The clip racked up millions of views in just 2 days. Journalists reached out. TV crews arrived at the shelter where Thomas volunteered. But true to form, he refused interviews. He wasn't interested in being the face of a moment. He hadn't stood his ground to become a symbol. He had done it because no one else should have to prove their worth just to be treated with dignity. And yet, the city began to change around him. The police department launched an internal review. Officer Daniels was suspended during the investigation, then required to complete an intensive program in de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. He later released a public statement, "What I did was based on assumption, not fact. On fear, not reality. Mr. Grant showed me the kind of strength I hope to earn one day." Thomas, when asked about the apology, simply said, "If he learns, that's enough for me." But the impact didn't end there. City leaders introduced a new training module for all law enforcement, called the Grant Principle, focused on treating every person with assumed value rather than suspicion. Schools started sharing the story during Black History Month. Students wrote essays about dignity, about judging less and listening more. One classroom even painted a mural showing Thomas, walking quietly with his coffee in hand, above the words, "Real power doesn't shout." Back at the shelter, nothing changed for Thomas. He still arrived early, still tied on his apron, still served food with a soft smile and called every guest by their name. But now, people came not just to eat, but to thank him. To shake his hand. Some brought their children to meet him. Others, just to sit beside him for a moment. And Thomas never once talked about the moment. He let others do that. Because he believed that if you had to remind people of your worth, it was already lost. He knew his strength. He didn't need to prove it. He had lived it. Weeks later, Officer Daniels asked to meet him privately. Not for cameras. Not for press. Just man to man. Thomas agreed. In a quiet room at the shelter, Daniels sat across from the man he had once shouted at. Nervous, fidgeting, unsure how to begin. Thomas, calm as ever, broke the silence. You've been through a lot, haven't you? Daniels nodded. Not like you, he said. Thomas leaned forward. Pain is pain. But what matters is what you do with it. They talked for over an hour. About service. About duty. About fear, and how it poisons judgment. About how sometimes, the greatest battles happen in silence, and how the hardest enemy to defeat is often the one inside us. Daniels left that day changed. And from that moment forward, he became a different kind of officer. Slower to speak. Quicker to listen. Less concerned with control, more focused on connection. Some noticed. Others didn't. But Thomas did. He always did. Months passed. The city kept moving. But the story lingered, shared in classrooms, repeated in council meetings, whispered by strangers at cafes. A story of an old man who didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't raise his fists, but won a battle that many believed couldn't be won without force. Thomas never called himself a hero. But heroes never do. He passed away quietly 2 years later, in his sleep, in the same modest apartment he had lived in for over a decade. At his memorial, hundreds gathered. Some in uniform. Some in suits. Many in jeans and worn jackets, people from the shelter, the community, the streets he walked every day. Officer Daniels was there, too. He stood at the back, his hands folded, his badge not visible. Not because he was hiding it. But because, for once, it wasn't about him. The city later renamed the community shelter in Thomas's honor. Not as a gesture of apology, but of respect. The Thomas Grant Center now serves over 300 people every week. And at the front desk, behind a sheet of glass, sits the original leather folder, military ID, medals, and the newspaper clipping, preserved for everyone to see. No captions. No headlines. Just a quiet reminder of what one man did by standing still. And now, we ask you, how many people do we pass each day without seeing them? How many stories are buried behind tired eyes, old coats, and quiet voices? What would our world look like if we listened before we judged? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. A coworker. A friend. A stranger. Thank you for watching King of Tales. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that reveals the truth behind the silence. And join us next time, when we tell the story of a high school janitor who solved a math equation the teachers couldn't, and the secret he had hidden for decades. Until then, stay curious. Stay humble. And remember, the strongest people often speak the least, and still change everything.